If you enjoyed this episode of Spotlight On, please share us with a friend and leave a review or star rating on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast featuring musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping music, arts, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on author Jonathon Grasse, whose new book, Jazz Revolutionary, traces Eric Dolphy's journey from the clubs of 1940s Los Angeles through his groundbreaking work in New York's avant-garde jazz scene. Eric Dolphy's revolutionary voice in jazz was silenced far too soon. He was an artist who pushed the boundaries of what was possible on alto sax, flute, and bass clarinet, collaborating with giants like John Coltrane and Charles Mingus before his tragic death in 1964 at just 36 years old. Jonathon's intimate portrait reveals both the innovative musician and the gracious human being remembered by those who knew him. And now, Jonathon Grasse. Well, I have to tell you, I've been looking forward to this one. Incredible. It's so long overdue. You know, your sort of multidiscipline background in terms of being an academic, a composer. I'm curious sort of how your technical understanding of music and the instruments, if at all, how did that shape your approach? How do you think maybe that would be different from how a more sort of journalistic or solely journalistic biographer might approach this?
Yeah, the answer may be a bit too complicated, but streamlining that, I had to walk back, technical stuff. I worked with some people in the publishing process, and it was deemed to either go off into the deep end and try to do transcriptions and do more complex harmonic stuff and, tune analysis. That's not a very interesting thing for me, even though I teach music theory and I understand that. I became much more focused on a broader general audience that would appreciate every page of the book. So there are no music examples, and that's by design. How that shaped the project as opposed to something that would be more journalistic. I really appreciate journalistic writing in that it's engaging, it's typically a fresh use of language and inviting tone. And I do my best, but I struggle with that side of my writing. And I think a compromise just sort of came along with the skeleton of the project itself, which is really day-to-day, like a diary type of approach to accounting for his recordings and whereabouts and interactions. And yeah, so the technical side of the academic background kind of, receded into the back of the room often. And another thing that sort of was a challenge and kind of complicated the approach is just really the lack of primary sources. Dolphy's been dead for 60 years. I did contact people like bassist Richard Davis is still alive, although it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to use any interview material due to because of his advanced age and the nature of some of his answers to my questions.
Yeah.
But there are very few personal contacts, and that was kind of an isolating factor that left it up to me to structure this in a very streamlined, direct timeline sort of fashion. Yeah.
I appreciate your comment about Richard Davis. I had a similar or somewhat similar opportunity to talk with McCoy Tyner several years back, and I actually chose not to. I used to live in New York for a very long time, and I'd go see him several times a year at his Blue Note residencies. And I just felt that, I guess the best way I could say it, this isn't quite articulate, but I kind of felt like I should just leave him alone.
Yeah.
He was clearly having his health issues as he was older. He was so soft-spoken. as I read other interviews with him, I saw that he kind of relied on sort of like the same stories or the same tropes to get through interviews. And it just didn't feel like, for however exciting it would have been personally for me, he's my hero musically. It just seemed like I didn't have a larger aim of what I wanted to get out of him. And so, kind of like, why do it? I know different in that you had a clear purpose, but I can relate to that, how the advancing age and, there's only so much we can expect from people, especially to recall events with any clarity that happened, a lifetime ago, a literal lifetime ago. Something you brought up that I'm very curious about is this sort of day-to-day aspect or the diaristic aspect. As you were dealing with some of the session dates, personnel notes, a lot of things that I think that you wound up cleaning up or clarifying in your process. Do you think you made any discoveries that sort of shed new light into either Dolphy's development, or, were there things you came across that you were like, wow, that's a missing piece for me, or that's genuinely additive?
Well, for me personally, yes, the process of putting everything together was like a, proverbial light bulb effect pretty regularly through the writing. It's like, oh yeah, I see now. He actually did, leave the free jazz session and go straight to Inglewood, New Jersey to record another album that day. Stuff like that was like, oh, remarkable.
Free jazz.
Oh, there are plenty of anecdotes, like always assuming Eric was part of an Ornette Coleman concert in Cincinnati. There's this incident where a promoter promoted it as free jazz, and all these people showed up expecting no admission, and Ornette apparently canceled out of, frustration that no, it wasn't free. And even a very recent Ornette biography says Eric was there, and he wasn't. He was in England touring with Coltrane in November of 61. So there are a lot of little things like that, but mostly discoveries. And putting it all together, I think, was not just a challenge, but a call, right? Part of the expectation for any reader, I think, at this point, if you're going to say, hey, this is the first real full biography, you have to pull everything together. So the timeline reveals, interesting things in and out of the Mingus workshop. He wasn't in consistently, month after month, year after year. He left several times I don't want to say whenever he could, but, for opportunity for his own career, yes, whenever he could, he would leave for livelihood or for opportunity. And of course, Mingus loved Dolphy very much. They were very close, and being the, somewhat hard to get along with group leader, antagonizing some of his ensemble members pretty regularly. That's a matter of record. That's not just my opinion, but to kind of characterize Dolphy as going in and out of the Mingus workshop is accurate. He would leave when he could, and he was grateful for the livelihood when he was welcomed back, which was any time he was available, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
In an earlier version of the book, I tried to extrapolate that relationship, and I didn't want to contrive anything, but there is something to say more about that relation, and with Coltrane for sure. I hope future writers who come across memoirs or have some other sources, what have you, extend an understanding of Dolphy's work with Mingus and Coltrane, because as you said, what are some discoveries, new things? And I think there's still more out there.
Yeah.
I just had to draw the line in the sand and finish the book and continue while there's detail probably lacking in the description of some of those relationships, but there you have it.
Well, I'm going, obviously, it's a bit of foreshadowing. I'll come back to Coltrane in a few moments. It would be impossible not to dig into that, but I'm curious a little bit about Los Angeles as a place where Dolphy sort of received so much education. You talk about some of the figures that he studied with and worked alongside. And I'm curious about Los Angeles in the 40s and 50s as it relates to his musical development and sort of his foundational work there. Could you talk a little bit about the role of place and his place in that setting?
Certainly. I think it would be appropriate to start with his parents, the fact that he was the only child of loving immigrant parents who cherished, the thought of him becoming a professional musician. That's the feeling I get from the sources, is that they encouraged him to take music very seriously, and he did from, roughly the age of 6 onward. So the home life, the stability of that, and also, as you say, the importance of place, we can go to my habit in the book of mentioning the distances from his home. A club was 2 blocks away, or he could walk to his junior high school. Central Avenue was just down Jefferson Boulevard as he was, coming of age, the prime of Central Avenue. And the other thing you mentioned was learning and teaching, and as his coming of age space was filled with public school music opportunities in public schools with these wonderful music teachers. I'm saying they're wonderful. Who knows? But the outcome was wonderful.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so he excelled. He was encouraged to become a multi-instrumentalist by the age of 13, 14 years old. His music teachers was like going, yeah, try the flute now, try the oboe, try the alto sax. So he absorbed that type of positive encouragement and support through public school music programs. And as I said, obviously his parents giving him the right of way to practice at home, which could have been torture for a while. But then after a while, they obviously gained a lot of respect for his accomplishments, I think, too, because there's some structure to all that. It's not just woodshedding and practicing their performances and memberships and, school orchestras and winning little awards and things like that. And to move on through into the 40s, those were such amazing times, the rise of bebop. He was a fan of R&B. He loved classical music. He dreamt of adolescent dreams of playing in an orchestra, oboe. That's a painful reality to come of age in segregationist, racist America. As we all know, the color line, that phrase, is a sad reminder that he would have had zero chance of making it through the ranks.
Yeah.
Sure enough, there's the pretty, I say verifiable just because several authors have referenced his being rejected by those who are running a USC summer program for student musicians, and he was rejected because he was African American, apparently. I include that in the book without documentation, but so many people reference it. Certainly, when he comes of age and becomes a jazz musician, he has Central Avenue, he has Gerald Wilson, he has Lloyd Reese, an independent music educator, and of course his friends and colleagues in the clubs, and his experiences with Roy Porter and the 17 Beboppers is still educational, even though he's out of high school. He's 20, 21, late teens, playing professionally, getting hired for these side groups, and discovering those things and putting them all together was important for me. Nat Meeks and different gigs that he held on to, some subbing jobs through Gerald Wilson. And these are all big topics that could break off from the discussion of place in Los Angeles. But it also ties off with his stint in the U.S. Army stateside during the Korean War. Upon his return, a lot of that nightlife was gone. Central Avenue had been swept aside, and sort of, the economic decay of the post-war years and other social factors they definitely altered the landscape of that place that was Los Angeles, Central Avenue. LA is strong on the horizon for any Dolphy story simply because of that ample, musical broadening and all the opportunities that LA had to offer.
Yeah.
And the entertainment industry is certainly, obviously, Buddy Collette being a primary mentor while also being, a pioneer African-American breaking into the entertainment industry and coaching Dolphy on his multi-instrumentalism, trying to become a a valid young musician.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or entry-level gigs with the industry, whether it be rock and roll or session work for a crooner or what have you.
Yeah.
So between Buddy Collette and Gerald Wilson and Jerome Richardson, who to me somehow still remains a mysterious persona, but was an accomplished musician and great session player and multi-instrumentalist himself, that group really was like the perfect upbringing of a still young musician, just with great chops and reading skills and tone and all of that on 3 instruments, which is pretty remarkable.
You spoke a little bit about, sort of the really sad and disappointing history of race relations and how they impacted his artistic opportunities, his career opportunities. I'm curious about Gunther Schuller and what you know about Dolphy's sort of work and ability to interface with third stream, and what were you able to learn about what that meant to him?
That's an excellent point. And for several reasons, I think primarily in the big picture, it was hugely important to Dolphy. And the reason that's important is that I think in general, and I was previously many years ago also of the opinion that the third stream was questionable. And I add that in my book, just a devil's advocate sort of discounting of that artistic attempt in the late 50s through the 60s. But rather than, deconstruct it in that negative way, I really ended up seeing and sensing that Dolphy was extremely proud of being a musician capable of entering a concert hall and playing a challenging new music piece, with a conductor, with chamber music instruments, a string quartet. He loved it. I think he and Mingus shared, as I say in the book, this quote unquote universalist approach to all music being powerful and expressive and broadening style and performance practice goals beyond what jazz had to offer. And that's not putting down jazz, that's throwing a spotlight on the magnitude of these musicians and their capabilities. So with the Schuller contact, it was just a godsend for Dolphy, I believe. They became, from what I gather, they became very close friends. They played a lot. They rehearsed together. Schuller seized on this in his own artistic world by featuring Dolphy as a member of many groups, not just in the studio, but with these concert music gigs, Syracuse, Carnegie Hall, Chicago, regular appearances playing challenging concert music that was a so-called fusion with jazz. And I went out of my way to include some negative reception of that in the press, a downbeat article here or a mainstream newspaper review there that comments on, hey, what is this stuff? What is Schuller trying to do? And then on several occasions down towards the end of the review, it's like, however, Eric Dolphy was awesome, right? So I think the Schuller contact validated in so many ways Eric's hard work in becoming a master musician with broad interests and, factoring in the racial politics of the time, African-American performers on stage of a concert hall where oftentimes they wouldn't necessarily have been welcome, but I'm not a specialist in that. I don't know that as a part of my research. I'm just happy that I found the sources, and they're simple sources, whether it's another scholar's work that I quote or liner notes or a review, what have you. There seems to have been a buzz about how successful Dolphy was in that arena.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Jonathon Grasse right after this break.
The Tone Arm, found at thetonearm.com, is our online magazine dedicated to extraordinary artists whose work pushes our culture in new and exciting directions. This week on The Tone Arm, read an interview with jazz critic Paul DeBarros, where he reveals the challenges in telling the story of NPR host and pianist Marian McPartland. Check out an innovative trio from Munich named Prepared, who meld Steve Reich's cyclical patterns with club music's magnetic pull. Discover the musical world of Avi C. Engel, an artist weaving ancient sounds, field recordings, and poetry into music that demands an imaginary cinema. And the tone arm is joined by Are You Serious of Mondo 2000, who writes about his personal history with David Bowie's work and how he interprets the artist's dialogue with American counterculture. You'll find all of this and much more at thetonearm.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for the Tone Arm's email newsletter, which includes updates on our stories, news about the Spotlight On podcast, and exclusive notes from our view of the underground. That's thetonearm.com, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On.
I have to turn to the Coltrane era. And full disclosure, the Village Vanguard performances and the subsequent European tour in '61, it's my favorite music.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've gone down many rabbit holes with it, but what an extraordinary gift when they chose to release those full performances. But before we get to that, I think something that's very interesting, not entirely surprising given what we know about Coltrane, but really fascinating to learn about the extent of how much Coltrane and Dolphy played together, even outside the public eye in the context of practice or what they were teaching and learning from each other. I'm really curious about your perspective on their musical relationship off the bandstand. What did you learn or what do we now know about the extent of their musical relationship?
Yeah, well, I think off the bandstand, they were friends. They were deeply connected friends. That goes back to 54. And it's kind of legendary, worth repeating that, Coltrane was strung out when he came through LA and was fired from the Hodges band. And Dolphy picked him up. They met. Apparently, Dolphy helped him out, get him on his feet, what have you. What are the details of that? I'm not really sure, but I know that it led to even more connections and friendship. When Dolphy moved and relocated in Brooklyn, there's a strong Coltrane connection there. Coltrane's cousin either owned the townhouse or sublet it. I'm not really sure, but that crash pad on Carlton 245, right? The tune 245 comes from that place. Apparently, according to Freddie Hubbard and some other incidental comments, Coltrane, when he finished up with Miles in 1960, started to, they hung around. Coltrane was busy gigging and touring and recording, very successful, hugely successful. I mean, my God, My Favorite Things, Giant Steps, really earning the right to call his own shots with Impulse the next year. Thank goodness, having the position, if you will, with the label, however that worked, the business side, working with management and venues. No, I'm a quintet now. Eric's playing with us. And there's even there's a little bit of friction with I think McCoy Tyner, had mentioned, he's very polite. He and Elvin Jones were very polite about Eric Dolphy's playing, but I sense that there was sort of like a relief, not a relief. I don't want to mischaracterize this at all. There's no hard feelings that I ever read about or heard about. I guess what I'm saying is Coltrane did kind of go out on a limb, and he knew it by getting Dolphy on stage. And note that they never recorded outside of, Ole and the Africa Brass sessions. They never went back into the studio. All of those collaborations are live recordings. A lot of them are bootlegs.
Yeah, all the radio transcriptions from Europe. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So to circle back to I think the core of your question is their friendship was a serious one. I couldn't help but notice Ben Ratliff's comment about Coltrane keeping Dolphy's photo in his hotel room after Dolphy's death.
Yeah.
And keeping in touch with his parents after Dolphy's death. And that's just a lifelong bond, basically. Now, musically, I completely respect, the jazz historians and critics who, especially the Coltrane fans who, they start to discount Coltrane's latter output. I get it. I like it and respect it, but I understand there's a huge stylistic shift away from Coltrane's most popular sound, most popular recordings. But there were enough commentators invoking Dolphy's name and suggesting, hey, Coltrane started to change. He started to play more out there, and he started to, experiment with timbre and tonal leaps, what have you, all the technical things that Bill Cole and Porter and others, Jerry Allen, I cite them in the book because I think that was an important moment to back up my claim.
Yeah.
That they both benefited. This wasn't some sort of weird favor Coltrane was offering to Dolphy for a livelihood, which unfortunately some commentators have suggested. Coltrane had a deep respect and admiration for Dolphy's playing, and he said so, and he backed it up by bringing him into the band for, 16 months or 18 months. And also, playing with him sporadically until Dolphy left for Europe for the final time. So they were close musical partners, collaborators, and personal friends. And I really would love to see someone dig in more and find more sources and quotes and facts about their relationship, and Mingus as well. But yeah.
I mean, I'd read 1,000 pages just about final third of 1961.
Oh, isn't it? It really is incredible. Yeah. The build up to the Vanguard residency and then going to Europe, I don't think it's hyperbole to say it changed jazz. I mean, it certainly opened up possibilities for younger players to hear that kind of playing and go for it,
I would argue it opened a lane in jazz journalism as well, because, I can only see it retroactively, but, the whole, I don't know if we want to call it controversy, whatever, the downbeat interview that followed that spring. And it's so funny. I buy a copy of it every few years on eBay just to read it again. And then I give it away because I think other people should read it who love that music. I suppose I have to just let it go and not be mad about it. But
that's fantastic.
I'm really just to stay in the Vanguard stuff for a moment. And I know we could spend a ton of time on it, but I'm really interested because I've never really spoken with anyone about the view of Dolphy changed once the expanded editions of the albums came out. For the longest time, we just had Village Vanguard and then whatever they called the other, I forget what it was, more Village Vanguard or Village Vanguard again. They put out a couple other sides, but to sit there and listen to all those nights and all those sets, what kind of reassessment happened for Dolphy, if any? I think you'd be best to address, though, how is Dolphy's impact and contributions looked at differently?
I tried to exploit that in the book by bringing that up, by referencing the fact that so many more, complete sessions and complete re-releases that have been coming out. Well, if we date that Impulse complete Vanguard release back to the late 90s, you're talking about 30 years of hearing the real Dolphy, because the original releases, they weren't good. They did not put Dolphy in a good spot. They weren't good takes. They cut some solos. They chose a couple of tracks from the live sets that were not Dolphy at his best.
You could feel the impulse to try to be commercial or to be more, to sand off some of the more interesting aspects.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And at the same time, you can't blame labels for trying to make something more successful. After all, that's another, not to go on a sidetrack, but, Coltrane is such a cultural juggernaut on his own.
Yeah.
Coltrane doesn't need anybody to help him out, quote unquote. You get that release out there. It's like, oh my God, listen to that guy play. But Dolphy is definitely not in a good light for, whatever that is, 30 plus years. The Vanguard heritage did not ring true to what went down those evenings. Then you get the complete sessions and you realize that, no. If you were there, you saw an amazing multi-instrumentalist. Yeah. He didn't bring his flute, but he had his bass clarinet, as you know, and the alto sax, and he blew his heart out. And they had been doing that for 4 months. They had been gigging as often as they could, as busy as they both were.
Sure did.
Dolphy would drive out or fly out wherever, sit in with Coltrane in Philadelphia, Chicago. They had a little mini tour. And the Village Gate releases from last year are also revelatory because Olay, and then also, not to go on and on, but the complete Olay session reveals a great Dolphy take that no one had ever heard. I mean, that's another
Revelatory.
thing. So there's a conspicuous absence of good to great to excellent Dolphy solos in those early original releases that I think hurt his career. I think it hurt his career that he's listed in the personnel of Impressions and some of the early Vanguard things, and they weren't the optimum. And I think critics said, see, the guy is dragging down Coltrane. And only later do we get the big picture. And that's, I try to emphasize in the book, and I hope I don't kind of overdo it, but each new release, and then we get to the FM records, the Alan Douglas re-release of just on Resonance just a few years ago, the complete Conversations Iron Man release that's just amazing, a 3-record set. Those are treasures. They're vital treasures that aren't just valuable, to listen to, but they tell a story. Like, where were these recordings, back when? But that's not that unusual in the music biz, right?
Yeah. Well, it also makes me very grateful that, especially in the emergence of, music resurfacing on the internet, that those radio recordings from Europe did resurface and did start to circulate more outside of just sort of the collector's world. And one of the things that is really beautiful about that is in a lot of the recordings, you can hear the enthusiasm of the audiences. It's special to be reminded of that. It's sort of like, yet again, the European audiences are a little hipper, but just the amount of music that band expressed over those months it's really astounding. It's really astounding.
And of course, when they came back in early 62, you have some Birdland recordings of the post-European tour that were fortunately illicitly bootlegged, and there's some pretty, decent quality audio on for some of those releases. Yeah.
It's really funny. Before we leave this era, every time I go into the Village Vanguard, it's like few other places. Like I'm so distracted by the history there. It's really hard to put out of your head. No matter how wonderful the music is you're seeing and hearing in the moment, it's really hard to put out of your head. Like, my God, the things that happened here.
Yeah.
and the room has that sound, that dry sound. It's like, it just sounds like the Village Vanguard. It's a special place.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Dolphy as a sideman and the Dolphy as a band leader, especially as a composer. I mean, I find myself, I get really wrapped up in, I find it very difficult to pull the strands apart of his roles and his identities. Was that an aim of this book? I mean, I guess it's an obvious question. I suppose it was, but how do you primarily view him now? Was leader, composer, ultimate sideman, muse and inspiration? Like, how do you think about Dolphy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think after the fact, completing the book and going through it and hearing other people's comments on it, my view on him has completely changed. Previously, since high school, in the 70s, when Frank Zappa released, the Eric Dolphy Memorial Barbecue track on Weasel's Rip My Flesh, I had no idea who Eric Dolphy was. So in high school, I grabbed one of the Prestige reissues, and I could not believe, I just fell for that sound. I love his solos. I love his tunes. I think now I realize the whole person, if that's fair to say, his trajectory, his personal trajectory, his struggles. But to circle back, I just no longer see him as the guy who only has a few albums under his own name as a leader, right? So, and that might be the case with a lot of Dolphy fans. It's like, well, he only released a few albums, then he died, right? But in tracking his life and his sessions, the sideman stuff is so important to jazz history. And he's not the only one. Tons of sidemen, define the sound or are worthy of discussion, obviously. But in Dolphy's case, in my case of interpreting him, it's just changed to be, his world rather than just what albums he led. Finding so much out there that, were one-off sessions on an afternoon 62 years ago, what have you. He laid down great solos and packed up his horn and left. And that was his life. He was like the gunslinger. But that's woven into, his struggle to get a friggin' contract after Prestige dumped him. And then to fall into this kind of odd, we're all grateful for FM Records for, Douglas let him record all these tracks for Conversations in Iron Man, the live stuff at the 5 spot, or debut in Europe, releasing his Copenhagen stuff. It's all magic. It's all treasures. But he was dumped by Prestige. He struggled to get any label. He's kind of mocked in the press. It's hard now for me to separate, a lot of those trials and tribulations, separate that from the celebration of his music as a leader, as a band leader, and with his Prestige work. And of course, Out to Lunch, most people think of him in regards to Out to Lunch, which was thanks to FM Records giving him permission to record on Blue Note. That's a great classic avant-garde collection of recordings, Out to Lunch. So I think I went from maybe what you could say generally is like the quote unquote typical jazz fan who has a player that they listen to really trying to appreciate his life work and his routines and struggles. Now it's kind of hard to separate any of that out. I see the whole person based on, my coverage and his times. I'm fascinated with the times.
Yeah.
The late 50s, early 60s, frankly, the revolution in the air, the change, the civil rights movement, the politics, the Kennedy assassination, the Cold War, liberation of quote unquote developing third world, former colonial countries. All of that is an energy that moves forward. And I just see him as being in the middle of that as well. That's what he lived, flying in for his first European gig as leader a few weeks after the Berlin Wall started to go up. Stuff like that. It captivates me. I was born in 1961, so, I wasn't around consciously in those early years, but I have a strong impression of the time just as a historian, if you will.
Do you think why wasn't he in one of Impulse's flagship artists? And if he had survived, would he have been, or was Impulse not big enough for him and Coltrane?
I just don't know the answer to that. I don't know really what would have happened contract-wise if he had just remained healthy and, theoretically, he could still be alive today in his 90s. That would be remarkable, right? But I just don't know what the business model was saying to the label at that time. I know, and I'm no expert. In that sense, I'm no jazz scholar where I could just off the top of my head, bring out a discussion of details about the labels. To be honest, I don't know what would have happened. I know that what is it, ESP? He may have come back and participated in a renaissance of free jazz in the end of 64 into 65, and Albert Ayler persevered and struggled with a hard situation there. I don't know what Dolphy would have done, to be honest. He would have composed more. He was trying to broaden as a composer. And I know that there are these anecdotes from Han Benek and Mengelberg regarding his exposure in Holland and Amsterdam to some pretty good classical ensembles that were interested in playing with. I think he would have broadened that. That would have been hard for a label to say, well, what do we do with this guy? He's playing with the Berlin Philharmonic, not that they would have, but I'm just saying by conjecture, And further collaborations, maybe, if he had lived, there would have been more work with George Russell. I know there are several references to the fact that he and George Russell stayed in touch. He may have been already contracted or scheduled to play with George Russell for some sort of broadcast event in London later in '64, I believe. But again, yeah, hard to say.
Yeah. It's not an elegant analog, but I think about Joe Henderson, someone who was so deeply rooted in sort of blues and jazz and understood where the music came from, but was also, out far on the edge out in the frontier for so many years, both musically and then ultimately, it took a long time for him to get reassessed. Made wonderful music, obviously. In fact, some of his late career work is incredible, but they were similar in that way that they both incorporated and transcended the whole tradition. We're so forward looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
As our time together starts to wind down, I'm curious about, do you think his multi-instrumentalism made it hard for people to figure out where to place him? Is he identified as a saxophonist? I feel too close to it to think about it.
Yeah, I think he's thought of as a saxophonist, and of course there are already people doubling on flute. I think the bass clarinet is that sort of third wheel, so to speak, that on one hand is awe-inspiring when you realize the talents and the different challenges to play the way he did on those instruments. But I know that there's some voices that suggest that it held him back or complicated the view of him. I kind of not ignore that, but there's so many other things to consider with his career and output and discography. I don't think it hurt him at all. It raised some eyebrows and opened some eyes as to what was possible. Certainly bass clarinet. I mean, I was very fortunate to find my way in my research with his relationship with bass clarinet. I think that's really pioneering to have done what he did in the 50s with Chico Hamilton. And Chico Hamilton, kudos to him for bringing such a wild sound into his otherwise, I'm not putting his music down, but the repertoire is a little staid. It's a little too cool.
Yeah.
I use the term, meandering arrangements. Sometimes the material from Chico Hamilton quintet albums from that period just don't stick with me. And then there's Dolphy soloing on bass clarinet. There's incongruity, but yet there's also a window that's opened into what this guy's going to do. And the other players are great. I mean, I'm not putting down the ensemble at all. It's just some of the artistic decisions that were made while Dolphy was a part of the group, are conflicting.
It's like Sonny Chirac playing with Herbie Mann. It's like on the face of it, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about choices you had to make or feelings you had around, talking about his dietary habits, his diabetes, sort of the personal details that are obviously important to how the story ends, in air quotes, while also trying to maintain a focus on Eric Dolphy, the artist. How did you navigate that internally, and are you good with how it manifested in the book?
I am, because I caught myself. I had the Jeff Schwartz, who wrote the foreword. We're friends and musicians together, and he pointed out in an earlier version that I allude to his death too often. For whatever reason, a literary device or something I felt at the time in writing a passage. And what I did is I ended up recognizing that was kind of overboard. I went back through that and a whole spade of other issues with previous versions. And I cut that back just because it's so obvious. I stated it's pretty clearly understood for most readers that he died young. It's stated so clearly early in the book. And as far as the diabetes, the diet, I really did look for sources. I wanted to understand how this was manifesting, and any inkling or hint of health issues. I tried to understand that. And it's just really obviously the core of the tragedy of his early death is this undiagnosed diabetes that just whittled his body away. I, looked in a little bit to what were some of the inevitable symptoms he was experiencing, and it's pretty awful. And it wasn't just in his last days. It would have been for months that he was suffering from the symptoms of this, maybe some confusion, pain, slow to heal things. He had oral thrush. He had a mouth infection in early 64 that kept him out of the workshop. Mingus had to find some replacements. He couldn't play, and that healed up, and he just continued on because he had to. That was his livelihood. So he was probably had some pain, which is remarkable when you hear the Mingus live in Europe stuff from 64 and the US, the Cornell Town Hall, the big Mingus stuff from April of 64. He's just magnificent. I mean, great playing. Some of his best work, I think, is that stint with Mingus in 64. So any anecdote from Schuller, from Buddy Collette, from Juanita Smith, Hale Smith and Juanita Smith is very good friends. There are little anecdotes about, oh yeah, he only ate white beans, or he and Coltrane had honey at every gig and he would literally eat honey, that he didn't look great. Of course, his fiancée, Joyce Mordecai in Paris, states on film, and in the film Last Date, she's interviewed, and it's just heartbreaking. No one really knew what was going on, and she, years later in the film is recounting that horrible moment when he was hallucinating and he had to go off and play in Berlin. I later found a reference, I forget from whom. One of his Dutch colleagues commented that he had already postponed the Berlin gig. I didn't get any of that from any other source, so I didn't really include it. To me, it's hearsay, but it could be the case that he was sick enough in Paris before going to Berlin that he actually canceled some gigs, but yet he also had a contract supposedly to go to Japan and Australia. But again, I haven't seen the contract. It doesn't exist anymore, but his mother, Sadie, had commented on that. So the sort of whittling away of his body and his mind leading to a coma and then the insulin shock. Supposedly it was probably insulin shock that he died from in the hospital. But they were trying to save his life. And I think that's kind of I don't want to say unfair. It's actually natural for people to be suspicious about what happened. And people are very bitter about that. I found all kinds of weird stuff on the internet, right? He went into a coma. People have to understand he was going to die. He's either going to die or he was going to suffer serious brain damage from a diabetic coma, the insulin shock. I'm not a medical expert, but it does appear that he must have been injected with either too much or too strong insulin, or it was a typical risk that doctors took in those moments to try to save someone, and that's what resulted. So, yeah.
Jonathon, thank you so much for making time and for the book. I mean, what an incredible work. So necessary. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Lawrence. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm grateful to be able to share these tidbits and to answer questions, and I'm glad you liked the book, so I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathon Grasse. As always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music? That's by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.